Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So this week I read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So I have read this a couple times before. They were a really long time ago. I read it once in high school and once early as an undergrad in college. I'm a big fan and believer in rereading things. I think like with a book like Jane Eyre and with like the really long gaps I took in between reading it, I really forgot a lot about the book and the plot and what's happening, so it didn't feel so much like rereading. But also I found that I interpret things really differently and see the story really differently from a different age. So I think that can be a really interesting thing you get from rereading a book is obviously the text is staying the same, but you can kind of see how you've changed by how you read it differently. So a big change and realization in this reading of Jane Eyre is that Mr. Rochester sucks. I had a really big drop off with that character. But I also feel like I finally understood and began to really like the character of Jane Eyre herself. And I hadn't really read it like that before, so it's interesting that I feel like I have such strong opinions now. I've also discovered, I don't know what it is exactly, but obviously there is a love plot in this story, but I don't think you can really read Jane Eyre like a romance. And it's certainly like in general discourse kind of falls in the same category as a lot of romantic kind of stories, but I feel like that's a mislabel in the marketing of it. I think the key for me to fully enjoying this book was just embracing the spookiness and the weirdness and the strangeness of it all, because it's this kind of supernatural undercurrent and all of the darkness in this book that makes it unique and interesting. So a quick summary of the story. Jane Eyre is an orphan and we get like 100 pages on her childhood and it's all horrible. Her parents die and she's taken in by an aunt who hates her and cousins who hate her. So the beginning of her life is not easy. And then she goes to a school for girls that is really harsh and terrible at first. The school changes a little bit and she changes too to adapt better to being there. So it ends up being a good place, but yeah, not so great at first. And so with this glimpse into Jane's past, we sort of understand her as a character a little bit more, her motivations and the kind of contradictions in her personality, because there's equal parts restraint and kind of fiery chaos in her. She's a really interesting character, but we see the roots of that beginning in her childhood. And we also see the beginning of the religious themes that take up a lot of this book. So the main reason why I find this difficult to read as a romance, and I think it is most entertaining and valuable read otherwise, is that Mr. Rochester, her romantic interest, is terrible. He is so weird and just like does bad things all the time and says terrible things. I mean, we see a lot of their conversations, and these conversations are like where Jane is falling in love with him, but he's like negging her constantly, like he's just insulting her all the time until the point where he's like, I'm in love with you, and then he starts showering her with compliments. It's very weird. And he's gaslighting her the whole time because he's hiding this huge secret. You know, it's an old book, so it's not really a spoiler, but he's got a crazy wife in the attic, and he makes her think that she's dreaming things. And he's just like, he's super moody. I mean, some of the descriptions of him are so funny. There's like this one part where she's like sometimes I would come into the parlor and he like has his head thrown down over his arms, which is just so funny because this character is supposed to be like a 40-year-old grown man. And he's so demanding of her time and her attention, which, you know, he is her employer when she first meets him. So she leaves Lowood and takes a governess position in Mr. Rochester's house, and that's how they meet. So there is this power dynamic there, but they never drop it when he's not her employer anymore. Like, he's just super weird. And then he does things that are crazy. Like there's this character, Blanche Ingram, that comes into the story. Jane thinks that Blanche is a potential wife suitor for Mr. Rochester. And then it turns out that he's not interested in her at all, has never really been interested in her, and mainly put on this whole show and brought her into the house for the sole purpose of making Jane jealous, which is elaborate and crazy. And then there's a scene in this book that just like, it continues to baffle my mind that anybody's like, it's so weird, it's so weird. While Mr. Rochester has all of these guests at his house, he leaves for a day and then comes back disguised as a fortune teller and tells everybody's fortunes. But it's mostly just like a ploy to mess with everybody and to try to get Jane to confessing that she's in love with him. And then we just accept that he dressed up as a beggar woman and came to his own door and did this, and nobody says anything about it. And the Victorian era was not a great time for women's mental health. So the whole issue of his crazy wife is interesting. Because basically the narrative that's given in the story is that she was diagnosed by a doctor as insane and then locked in a room for the rest of her life. It's like, is like the yellow wallpaper the Rochester's wife perspective here? Yeah, it can't help your mental illness to be locked in a room and to never see any other people for the rest of your life. Yeah, just Mr. Rochester is strange and not likable, and I think if you're expecting a romantic lead from him, you won't enjoy his character. But if you're expecting like a super spooky weirdo Dracula type, he is really entertaining and funny in the fact that he's just insane. Okay, so like I said before, Jane Eyre herself has been really lifted in my mind with this reading. Obviously I'd forgotten a lot of the story before rereading it this time, but I did remember that in past readings I thought Jane Eyre was really passive and kind of annoying in a way. Because in my mind it just seemed like she just let a lot of things happen to her. And there's a lot of moments where she like shows her fire in this book that I feel like I didn't remember. She has a lot of rebellion in her. She's just selective about the moments that she lets it out, right? She's interestingly calculated in that way. And she has this restlessness, which she talks about a lot in the novel. It's all in first person from her perspective. And it's this restlessness that she sees in other characters and connects to them. And when you consider that she has this stoic face, that's like her front, but inside she's kind of this wild, adventurous person. Her relationship with Mr. Rochester makes sense, right? If she's looking for adventure and interest in her life, somebody like him, it makes sense. So something I forgot about completely in this book, after she has been a governess with Mr. Rochester for a while, they fall in love, they're gonna get married, and then Jane finds out about this secret wife in the attic who likes to like set things on fire and all of that. And so Jane runs away in the night and by chance happens to end up on the doorstep of these people she later finds out are her cousins. And it's an interesting section of the book. It takes up a fair amount of time, so it's interesting that I kind of forgot about it because it's not a part of the book that's moving the romantic plot forward. But it is important for Jane developing as a character that she has this time. So Jane has always felt disconnected from the world. She's never had family or relations like that. So having these people that are family to her makes a big difference. And they're also intellectual equals, and that makes a big difference for her. And then there's this exposure she has to St. John, which kind of pushes her in the end to go and find Mr. Rochester again. So St. John's an interesting character. He's like a religious extremist, but it's authentic in a way. He really believes everything he's saying, and he was born to be a martyr in a lot of ways. He's willing to sacrifice his life and plans to perform God's work. But he's a character that doesn't seem to have any emotion or feeling beyond that. And so he's trying to push Jane into joining him in his missionary work as his wife, but basically just to be a workhorse for God's plan. And he's really bossy and kind of reflective of this passivity Jane has and her willingness to just like take orders from people sometimes. And she has to break past that to get out of this scheme that he has planned and find her own happiness. She has to stand up for herself. So it's really pivotal for her. It's a really important scene. She also, when she's with her cousins, like gains her financial independence too, which makes her connection to Mr. Rochester easier as well. So that whole time period where she is away from Mr. Rochester sort of sets things up for her to be able to return a better, more ready version of herself. And St. John, he's also interesting because he's the character we end on. We end on Jane Eyre imagining his last words, and it's this very religious note. And it's a note that echoes this girl that she knows at school in Lowood who died from typhoid, I think. But it's this kind of religious calmness and this absolute faith that both those characters have. And it's echoed from the beginning to the end. So I think that signals to us that yes, there's this romance plot line between Jane and Mr. Rochester, but I don't think that's really what it's all about. I think the religious themes and sort of thinking about the difference between authentic and inauthentic religious feeling is really the heart of Jane Eyre. And we're seeing these themes reoccur in a lot of different ways. There are a lot of characters who are hypocritical in their religion throughout the book, right? And Jane spends a lot of time worrying about the state of Mr. Rochester's soul. So these themes keep coming up. And then in the end, I think we ultimately understand the theme when Jane is given a supernatural religious sign to go and find Mr. Rochester, to not go to India with St. John, to give her life to work and probably die young. The religious sign tells her to go and find the person she loves. So it ends on this note of God wanting his people to be happy seems to be the theme here. And also seems like soulmates definitely exist in Jane Eyre. And all of this was certainly controversial in the time period that this book was written. So I don't know, I think maybe it's something that happens to women novelists, that if there is a romance element, we sort of put it categorically in our mind as a romance novel, or that's how we think of it. But Jane Eyre is so much more than that. It's dark, it's mysterious, and it's got all of this interesting social commentary worked into it. So I know that there have been a couple movies made out of Jane Eyre, and I'm pretty sure there's a mini-series too. I haven't seen any of those, but after reading it this time, I am really curious to see how they handle these characters and if they're really pushing them as romance movies, which I imagine they are. I just wonder if they include that fortune teller scene, because I don't understand how Mr. Rochester can hold up as an attractive romantic lead after he does that. So did Hollywood dare include that? I'm not sure, but I'm gonna have to check them out to see how they handle this really, really complicated book. I'm not sure how it would play on screen, really. So overall, Jane Eyre is a classic novel. It still surprises me, certainly is a book that warrants a reread, and it was a great read for October. All right, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching.